I believe it gives us a fairly wide canvas to speak on the economic and financial situation of the country. On the finance bill, I have a few points, and I'll be very brief on each point, knowing that I have very few minutes left. The Income Tax Act has 298 sections, if you do not count the sections with suffixes like A, B, AA, double B, etc. And it has 14 schedules. The finance bill has 125 sections, clauses, of which 84 pertain to amendments to the Income Tax Act. And the Honorable Finance Minister has moved 39 amendments to the 125 amendments in the amendment bill. Now, honestly, every member has to search his heart and say whether anyone understands these things. I did not. I spent a lot of time trying to understand, and I can't say I understand it. This is a legacy issue. I concede that. This has been going on year after year after year. But this must stop. This government claims that it will dump all old legacies. This is one legacy this government must dump immediately. And I think the entire Income Tax Act must be replaced by a direct taxes code. When we were in government, I had helped draft a direct taxes code. Then the Honorable Mr. Pranam Mukherjee tried to improve it. When I returned to the Finance Ministry, I tried to improve it. There are 3 versions of a direct taxes code. Many of the provisions will be outdated. So get rid of all of them. But please bring a direct taxes code immediately. No one benefits from this Income Tax Act except the chartered accountants and the lawyers. Specific points, sir. Firstly, what are you doing about charities? Now, the most famous clause in the Income Tax Act is Section 10, Clause 23C. In the printed book, it occupies 8 pages. The finance bill has amendments which run to 9 pages. So an 8-page clause is being amended by a 9-page bill. And subsection 23C alone occupies 9 pages. That is exempt income, including charities. And then we have sections 11 and 12, under which income from charities are exempt. They are subject to conditions in section 12 capital A, 12 capital A, capital B, and section 13. The Honorable Finance Minister has once again amended section 12 capital A. And there is another section called 115 capital T, capital D, which is about accreted income. Now, a day will come when a charity or a religious institution, which is a charity, or an institution, a trust, which is a charity, will say, let's get out of these clutches of this Income Tax Act. If we have an income, let's pay the tax at 10% or 20% or 30%, whichever is the applicable rate. Let's get out of the Income Tax Act. Most charities today, most trusts today are crippled by these provisions and the repeated amendments year after year after year. Please clean up these provisions. If you believe that charities and trusts have a place in this country, let them function with a reasonable degree of independence and light regulation. This is no way to encourage charities and trusts. If I was starting a charity or a trust, I will say I'll pay my tax, just leave me out of the Income Tax Act. And this whole concept of accreted income is very regressive. If the exemption is cancelled under 12A or 12AA, if it's cancelled, the entire income which had been exempt for the past several years is now deemed as accreted income, and on that accreted income you'll have to pay a tax. I think these are gross provisions. These are burdensome provisions. This is not the way to encourage large charities, large trusts. Yes, if there are misconducting charities and trusts, take action. But don't stifle, don't throttle the throat of charities and trusts by these provisions. The next provision is this novel concept called faceless assessment. Sir, earlier there was an assessing officer. He knew the assessee's history. He has the entire records with him. The assessees may have been an assessee for the last 30 years or 40 years or 50 years. He knows his history and then he will deal with the assessment. There are enough provisions to ensure that no income escapes assessment. Today we introduced a faceless assessment. We don't know who the assessing officer is. We don't know where he is. We don't know whether he has all the past records of the last 20 or 30 years. We don't know what assistance he gets. How is this an improvement? Of course, some people will argue a faceless assessment is a great improvement. According to me, this is a regressive provision. Numerous people have complained to me that this faceless assessment has put them through enormous hardship because we don't even know who's hearing the matter, who's deciding the matter, what records he has. The amusing part is the National Faceless Assessment Center has 3 units. There is an assessment unit, there is a technical unit, there is a verification unit. I ask honorable members, if you have the time and the inclination, go through those provisions. By the time an assessment is completed, if there are queries, submissions, clarifications, it will go from unit to unit to unit. From faceless center to the assessment unit, back to the faceless center, to the technical unit, back to the faceless center, to the verification unit, back to the faceless center, back to this faceless assessing officer. This is completely regressive. I'm sure sooner than later, the Honorable Finance Minister will recognize that this is not a progressive step, this is not a liberal step, and this is causing huge hardship to SSC. The next provision I want to draw the Honorable Finance Minister's attention is section 149(1)(b). Now, this is the time for reopening assessments. Earlier, the time limit was 4 years, but the assessing officer had 6 years under certain circumstances. Now, last year, the finance bill reduced the second part to 3 years. 2 years and 3 years. You have to open it within 3 years, but you can open it beyond 3 years under certain circumstances. It was a great relief to a lot of people because past assessments will not be reopened beyond 3 years. But this year, somebody in the CBDT decided that we should tighten this. I don't know if it escaped the scrutiny of all the board members of the CBDT. Today you have said it will be opened beyond 3 years and reopened up to 10 years. If the income that has escaped assessment is in the form of an asset, or is it in the form of an expenditure related to an occasion, or is it relatable to an entry in the books? Now, I spent about 10 minutes trying to think of what else can they have. If income has escaped assessment, it should be either an asset or it should be an expenditure which has been incurred You had an income, escaped income, and you spent it. Or it has to relate to an entry. What else can it there be? So in virtually every case, you will reopen it beyond 3 years, up to 10 years, if the assessing officer or now the National Faceless Assessment Center decides, in his case, we will reopen beyond 3 years. Now, this amendment is regressive. This defeats the purpose for which you reduced the time limit to 3 years. Please reconsider this assessment. This amendment is going to cause huge hardship and a huge amount of litigation. Now, finally, sir, what shape the Finance Act as amended and as amended by the Lok Sabha will take, nobody can visualize until our publishers, Universal Publishers, publishes the book. Nobody can understand what it is. So we are all waiting for the Income Tax Act as amended and as amended last year and as amended this year to be published so we can make sense of it. But believe me, I speak as a lawyer, and I also know several chartered accountants have asked me to say this in the House. You cannot today apply the Income Tax Act as amended this year. You will have to have all the books of every year, because there are sunset clauses, there are prospective clauses, there are retrospective clauses. For some assessment years, last year's amendment will apply. For some assessment years, 2 years ago, amendment will apply. For some assessment years, the prospective amendments will apply. It has become a complete minefield. Nobody escapes from this minefield. All you find is a lot of people crippled when they walk through this minefield. Please, I appeal on behalf of the House and on behalf of all the taxpayer community, please replace this. Let us assume it is a legacy issue. Please replace this with a clear, clean, simple direct taxes code. I must compliment the Finance Minister for introducing 139 8 capital A, which is what is called an updated assessment within a period of 2 years, although it is severely restricted. You can update your assessment only if you offer to pay more tax. If you are asking for reduction of tax, you can't update your assessment. If you're asking for a refund, you can't update your assessment. Now, whoever thought of this, there was a simpler way. Why do you have to touch your nose by taking your hand through your around your neck? You can touch it straight. All that they have to do is say, put the number of times you can file a revised assessment, which is now any number of times, limited to, say, 2. And give a time limit, 12 months, 18 months. Any SSC can file a revised assessment only for a maximum of 2 times, twice, and within a period of 12 months or 18 months. That's a much simpler provision. On the one hand, you have a revised assessment provision in which you can offer to pay more tax, claim more refund, or reduce your tax. On the one hand, you have an updated assessment provision under which you can only offer more tax. Now, the proof of the pudding is the eating. Let us see how many people file an updated assessment and offer more tax. I think the simpler approach is to allow a revised assessment for a limited number of times for a limited period. So I'm done with the Finance Act. You can speak on it as many sections you can take and as many hours you can speak, but I don't intend to speak on that. And we'll see how it operates in assessment year 22-23 and what kind of amendments will be brought next year to correct what you found are anomalies in this year's amendment and last year's assessment. I want to go to the appropriations bill. Now, honorable member who spoke before me said that our direct tax revenues have increased. Now, these are the numbers I have. I've taken it from budget at a glance. In 2013-14, after about 3-4 years, I think it's about 2009-10, for the first time, direct taxes revenue as a proportion of GDP exceeded the indirect tax revenue. And in 2013-14, when the previous government demitted office and the new government took over, the numbers are 5.6% of GDP was direct tax and 4.4% of GDP was indirect tax. This is progressive taxation. Direct taxes as a proportion increases and indirect taxes as a proportion of GDP decreases. This is the right direction. Now, this direction continued up to 2016-17. In 2016-17, sadly, indirect tax as a proportion of GDP crossed direct tax as a proportion of GDP. And I had cautioned it even then, this is a bad trend, reverse this. Indirect taxes as a proportion of GDP should not cross direct taxes as proportion of GDP. Actually, direct taxes must increase. Now, this year, 2021-22, according to a budget at glance, both have become equal, 5.4% and 5.4%. Next year, the finance minister expects that direct taxes will go up from 5.4 to 5.5, and indirect taxes as a proportion will come down from 5.4 to 5.2, which means we are reversing the bad trend that has been set in the last 5 or 6 years, which is good, and I hope the government achieves this. But, mark this, total of indirect taxes and direct taxes touched 11.2% in 2017-18. This year, it is 10.8%, and next year, it will come down to 10.7%. If your total taxes as a proportion of GDP falls by as much as 0.4% or 0.5%, there is something seriously wrong with your tax policies and tax administration. Taxes as a proportion of GDP are low in India, comparable to other developed countries and other emerging economies. We should increase our taxes as a proportion of GDP, but unfortunately, the trend is not very encouraging. I want to utter the word of caution again, that if your tax as a proportion of GDP does not grow, and if your direct taxes as a proportion of GDP does not grow, it means that people are accumulating income and wealth and not paying enough taxes, whereas the large mass of people who pay indirect taxes are bearing the bulk of the burden. The burden must be shared equitably. People must pay taxes, but the rich must pay more. The people who accumulate wealth must pay more. Last time I spoke on the budget, I did point out how the wealth of the top 1% has increased astronomically by 20 lakh crore in 1 year. So this is a bad trend. This is not a good trend and nothing to be proud about. Then I have another question. According to the budget at a glance, 2021-22, at current prices, the GDP will be 232 lakh crore. In 2022-23, it will be 258 lakh crore. And the budget at a glance correctly calculates nominal growth, underline nominal growth at 11.2%. Now, I want to ask the Honorable Finance Minister, does this estimate of 11.2% growth, which was made on the 1st of February 2022, have you had an opportunity to review it? There is now the Ukraine war. Supply chains have been choked. The shipping rates have gone up astronomically. There is a chip shortage. There is a shortage of containers. There is a shortage of credit. World trade will be affected. And in fact, the IMF has estimated that the GDP of every country will be down between 0.5% to 2%. Now, given all these developments in the last 8 weeks, are you still confident your nominal GDP will indeed grow by 11.2%? I don't wish ill. I wish it grows 11.2%, but I have serious reservations whether in the changed circumstances in the year beginning on 1st of April, it will actually grow at 11.2%. Now, assuming it grows at 11.2%, is the government still persisting with its projection that real GDP growth will be 9.5%, as it was said originally, then revised to 9%, as said subsequently, or as the chief economic advisor has said, 8%. Take any of these numbers. Is real GDP growth next year, will it be 9.5% or 9% or 8%? I think any of these three numbers is no longer credible. And I'll tell you why it's no longer credible. If nominal GDP grows at 11.2, take the smallest of the three numbers, 8%. Real GDP 8%, nominal GDP 11.2. Implied deflator, which is equal to the inflation, will be 3.2. Does anyone believe in the changed circumstances, inflation in India will in 22-23 be only 3.2? If it is 9, implied inflation is only 2.2. If it is 9.5, implied inflation is only 1.7. That will be heaven. That will be heaven. We are not yet at the doors of heaven. I seriously doubt the estimate that India's real GDP will grow at 9% or 8%. And I'll tell you why. In February, WPI was 13.1%. CPI was 6.1%. Food inflation was 5.9%. Manufacturing inflation was 9.8%. And fuel and light inflation, before these 5 days of increase in petrol and diesel prices, was already 8.7%. If food inflation, manufacturing inflation, fuel and light inflation are all close to 6% and above, and if CPI is over 6% and WPI is over 13%, how do you say with a straight face that inflation next year will be about 2 to 3%? These numbers are no longer credible, and I would urge the Honorable Finance Minister, it's not her fault that there is a war in Ukraine, but you must reassess. You must be resilient, you must be nimble, and reassess these growth projection figures and tell us, not today, tell us sometime, tell Parliament, what are the more realistic numbers of nominal growth and real growth. The final point is, I heard the Honorable Finance Minister emphasize once again in the Lok Sabha that this government believes that government capital expenditure will be a main driver of growth. I wish them well. But let's look at the numbers. The numbers are not inspiring. The rhetoric is inspiring, but the numbers are not inspiring. Let me tell you the numbers. In 2021-22, central government capital expenditure in the BE was 5,54,236 crore. In the revised estimate, it was shown as 6,02,711 crore. But actually, that's not the correct number, because there is a small print footnote. The footnote says 51,971 crore was repayment of debt for Air India. That's not capital expenditure. By no method of accounting is a repayment of debt capital expenditure. You deduct that 51,971. The revised estimate of capital expenditure is therefore 5,50,840 crore. The BE was 5,54,000 crore. The revised estimate was 5,50,000 crore. So actually, in the year that is coming to an end on 31st March, you spent 4,000 crore less than what you had estimated. Now, this was a difficult year, and there are many reasons why government capital expenditure never achieves the target that the finance minister or the prime minister or the cabinet decide. There are so many bottlenecks in government expenditure. so many levels of decision making, so much paperwork, and so much hesitancy in clearing projects, be that as it may. For next year, the Honorable Finance Minister has projected a capital expenditure of 7,50,246 crore. We were all very impressed when she read out that number. And she claimed that it is a point to point, it's an increase of 35%. Of course, that proportion is wrong. Whether we apply to the BE of this year or the RE of this year, that proportion is wrong, but I won't get into the arithmetic. The 7,50,246 crore is not a correct number. You have included, I raised this question when I spoke last, and I expect an answer. Have you included, let me rephrase it, have you included in 7,50,246 crore the 1 lakh crore that you will allow the states to borrow additionally for their capital expenditure? That's what the budget speech says. I think you have included, but to be fair and polite, I will not say you have included. I'll turn it around and say and ask it, have you included 1 lakh crore in 7,50,246 crore? If you have included this 1 lakh crore, then this will be counted as capital expenditure by the states if they borrow this 1 lakh and show it in their budgets. How can it be capital expenditure of the states as well as capital expenditure of the center? So if you have included this 1 lakh crore in 7,50,246 crore, my respectful submission is the real number is 6,50,246 crore. Over the current year's revised true estimate of 5,50,840 crore, it is an increase of exactly 1 lakh crore. A 1 lakh crore additional capital expenditure next year. What is it like? It'll be a mosquito bite. Your GDP is 258 lakh crore, in which a 1 lakh crore additional capital expenditure, if it materializes, will make no difference. I'm not saying you should not spend the 1 lakh crore. Please spend this additional 1 lakh crore. But this cannot be the driver of growth. The driver of growth can only be if private investment is the main driver. Household savings, people's savings, channelized into private investment can only be the true driver of economic growth. Government capital expenditure can supplement private capital expenditure, but unless private capital expenditure is stimulated, triggered, boosted, this will not make a difference. In fact, if the GDP, your government capital expenditure is barely 2.52%. 2.52% won't make a difference. We need a much larger investment that can only come from private investment. And private investment can only come if there are private savings, household savings, channelized into investment. I want to ask the government finally, have you lost faith in private investors? Or are private investors lost faith in investment in India? They are investing abroad. So somehow there is a lack of faith. Either private investors have lost faith in investing in India, or the government has lost faith in the private investor that they will invest in India. Please go into it. This will not give you the kind of growth we need. We need high growth. I'm cautioning the government once again, respectfully, you will not get 8%, you will not get 9%, you will not get 9.5%. The world is going through a churning. IMF has lowered everybody's growth rate by 0.5 to 2.5. I think we must settle for a lower growth, but we must achieve that lower growth. That lower growth can only be achieved if you encourage private savings, household savings, and find ways to channelize that into private investment. I'm afraid the year ahead is a difficult year. I wish the government well. I wish the Honorable Finance Minister well. But it is a difficult year, and it's better be forewarned that it will be a difficult year. It requires sound tax policies, sound financial management, and sound economic management. I wish the government well. Thank you.